All right, I'm going to switch our view to that.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy National Friends of the Library Week. My name is Marlena White, and I'm the current board president for the Friends of South Carolina Libraries, and I am thrilled to be here live from the Pat Conroy Literary Center with the executive director, Jonathan Haupt. I'm going to do a quick introduction of Jonathan, and then we will start the tour. Throughout the evening, we will ask some questions along the way, things that are pertinent to library friends, ways that some of the experience has with building a nonprofit group from the ground up may benefit our library friends across South Carolina. So, Jonathan Haupt is the executive director of the nonprofit Conroy Center and the former director of the University of South Carolina Press, where he created Story River Books, fiction imprint with Pat Conroy, named by Garden and Gun magazine as one of the top 10 things to love about the South. Jonathan's book reviews and author interviews have appeared in the Charleston Post and Courier, Low Country Weekly, Beaufort Lifestyle, Savannah Morning News, Beacon Magazine, Pink Magazine, Southern Review of Books, and Southern Writers Sweet Tea blog. He is the co-editor of the anthology Our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy, the recipient of 17 book awards. He is also host of the Live from the Pat Conroy Center podcast on the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and a frequent presenter on the writing and teaching life of Pat Conroy. He serves on the board of directors of the Friends of South Carolina Libraries and the South Carolina Academy of Authors, as well as the South Carolina Humanities Advisory Committee. In 2020, Jonathan was recognized with the Doug Marlett Literacy Leadership Award presented by the Pulpwood Queens, the largest book club in the United States. Jonathan, thank you so much for having us.
Oh, thank you, Marlena. Thank you for reading my introduction exactly as I wrote it, too. I appreciate that.
Affection and admiration.
Thank you all so much for joining us here in the Zoom room, and to everybody who watches this later or live on Facebook, on the FOSCL Facebook page as well. This is a lot of fun to show off our third location of our Pat Conroy Literary Center here in Beaufort. And we're going to do that by me walking around using an iPad for most of our time together tonight. That's not the computer we're on right now, so it's going to take me just a second to switch over when we get to that point. But as long as we have the camera facing where it is, let me see if I can show you a slightly better view of the room we're in. This is the education room, the classroom of our Conroy Center, named in honor of Dorothea Benton Frank, another extraordinary writer from the Low Country who was a dear friend to Pat Conroy. And of the 3 locations the Conroy Center has had, this is actually the first one that's had a dedicated classroom space. So it's in this room that we're in right now, where we hold our monthly book club meeting and our twice monthly writers critique group and series, and all sorts of activities go on right in here. The room is very flexible in that way. And I will show you quickly the other part of our education center, which is the next room over. Once we switch over the iPad, we have a conference room named in honor of Pat's widow and fellow Southern writer, Cassandra King Conroy. And that too is part of the educational suite of the center here. The center was created not long after Pat Conroy passed away, March 4th of 2016. Pat's widow, Cassandra, and Pat's agents, and a lot of his family and friends felt very strongly about creating a living legacy to Mr. Conroy, rather than something that would have been beautiful but passive, like a statue or some other kind of memorial. So it was because of the generosity of so many people who were mourning Pat Conroy in that moment, who wanted to be supportive of whatever was going to be created, that the center was born. It really was generosity from many, many people all over the country, to some degree all over the world, who wanted to donate, who wanted there to be something that they could continue to engage in as they do with our Conroy Center. We are TripAdvisor's top-rated destination in Beaufort, have been for about 3 years now, and that means a lot in a tourist-driven economy like Beaufort, South Carolina. And what that translates to is about 5,000 people making in-person visits here to the Conroy Center, a number that actually hasn't changed much even during our pandemic times, and many more than that participating in our programs, both in-person and virtual, some happening here in the Conroy Center, others happening with partners all over South Carolina and well beyond that as well. During the pandemic, by virtue of doing virtual programs like the one we're doing tonight, we discovered we could have access to an audience that was national and then international as well. The first time I did a virtual tour and there was someone from France on the other end of the Zoom call, I thought, well, we're just always going to do this. Why wouldn't we? Why would we have a connection now that is international and lose that? So we continue to offer these virtual programs even at a time when in-person attendance is back on the rise again. So with all that said, Marlena is going to help me by pressing some buttons on this computer, and I'm going to press some buttons on the iPad, and we'll get underway with our tour. All right, gang. So let's see.
Jonathan, while you're setting that up, I have
Yes.
a quick point.
Sure.
I think it's wonderful that you track the number of people that attend. I think that's a great metric for
There we go.
success of an organization, especially a nonprofit.
Yeah.
And that is something that Library Friends can do. You can check with your administration, your branch manager, to know the count of the people that are coming in and out of your library. That's a great selling tool when you're reaching out to the community for members and you want to let people know how many people are coming in and out of your library. And I'm sure most libraries are tracking it.
It is a really good metric of usage by patrons, however you choose to define that. Here's our Cassandra King conference room, by the way, just to tell you where we are in the center right now. And it's also a very helpful technique for funding. We, the Conroy Center, like so many nonprofits, get to apply for both city and county A-tax, accommodations tax, and money that's raised by heads on beds, tourist visits. And being able to say not only how many people visit you, but where they come from is a really important story to tell when going after that kind of funding as well. So let me flip the camera back around and we're going to see the view down the hallway. And I want to point out to you that what you see all the way at the end of the hallway is a big, beautiful glass door that looks out on the Beaufort River. And not just any part of the Beaufort River, but this is a stretch of a couple of blocks that go from our courthouse, or an old courthouse rather, to what's now Beaufort Elementary School. And there's some beautiful antebellum homes just beyond our view here. But this is actually a block of Bay Street that Pat Conroy wrote about in his novel Prince of Tides. And in the novel, it's called The Street of Tides. But that means that we, the Conroy Center, are actually just a block away from being in a Pat Conroy novel. So it's a lovely location. And this building, as I said, is the third one we've occupied, first one we've owned. And it's, again, the generosity of a whole lot of donors who make that possible. So we're up front now in the interpretive center of our Conroy Center. So the museum part, if you will. We were in the education wing at the end of the hallway. Now we're up in the museum part. There are 3 spaces up here, 3 gallery rooms, and we're going to go in each of them. And I'm going to show you some artifacts and tell you some stories. And since this is National Friends of the Libraries Week, some of those stories will relate very closely to Pat's relationships with books and libraries in particular. And some of those stories I've told in a program that I've got to do a bunch of times, probably 100 times or more, called I Was Born to Be in a Library, Pat Conroy's great love of libraries. And this is actually the first time I've ever done that talk in the context of walking around the Conroy Center. I have no idea if it's going to work. We're going to find out together. It's exciting. So let's go in what we refer to as the family room, which has material related to the Conroy family. And this quilt we're looking at was actually made by Pat's sister, Kathy. So she is the second oldest of the 2 Conroy sisters, about the middle of the birth order of all 7 kids. And she made this quilt as a 70th birthday present for Pat. And if we go right over here, we can actually see a photo of the family. Let me try and get that on camera for you. There they are. So this is Pat in the back, the oldest of 7 siblings. And this photo is from 1968. So Pat would have been 23 years old at the time, probably right after his first year of teaching. And he is surrounded there by his 7 siblings. That's Sister Carol Ann, the older of the 2 sisters, in the orange jacket on one side of Pat, and Pat's sister Kathy, the younger of the 2 sisters, in the blue on the other side. And those are Pat's brothers, Jim, Tim, Tom, and Mike, who are all surrounding Pat there. And then Pat's parents up in front, the real great Santini, Colonel Don Conroy, in his dress uniform, and then Pat's mother, Peg, on the other side there. And this is probably a good moment to tell you a little bit about Pat's parents too, since we're here in the family room. Pat's dad was one of the most highly decorated fighter pilots of his generation. And if I go this way, I can show you the wall of Santini over here, where we have Pat's father's medals on the wall.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna cook.
Oh, okay.
And over here, we have Pat's dad's Vietnam era flight jacket, which you all can see on the wall. There's a little bit of glare up there. I apologize for that. And then down here in the case below, we have Pat's father's burial flag and a whole lot of other memorabilia related to Don Conroy. The colonel was one of the most highly decorated fighter pilots of his generation. He served with distinction in World War II and Korea as a member of the Black Sheep Squadron, and then 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. He had clearance to deliver atomic weapons. That's how good of a fighter pilot Don Conroy was. But he was also a guy who could not leave the battle on the battlefield. He was physically and verbally abusive to the whole family, and Pat, as the oldest, got the brunt of that. The counterpoint to that was Pat's mother, Peg, and I'll show you a couple other photos of Peg while we're talking about her back here. She grew up in the backwoods beyond the backwoods without much access to public education. There she is with Jimmy Carter much later in life. And let's see if we can get this one down here as well. There she is, surrounded by a whole lot of kids and grandkids as well. What Peg discovered, however, at a fairly young age was libraries and librarians, and she was able to use them to fill in the gaps in her education. There was one book she was drawn to at a relatively young age, probably in her teenage years, maybe 18 or so, and that's this book, Gone with the Wind, by Margaret Mitchell. This was so important to Peg Conroy that she changed her middle name to Margaret and was known as Peg her whole life, inspired by this book. She started reading it to Pat when he was 5 years old, and that is not age-appropriate reading for a 5-year-old, by the way. It wasn't in 1950 and isn't now either, but she read it to Pat in this really interesting way in which she could equate every single character in Gone with the Wind with a real person from the Conroy's life. So she told it to Pat not just as the story of the book, but as the story of his family and friends as well. And that shaped the way that Pat read everything, and it shaped the way he encountered the world. Peg was so well read that she was actually able to masquerade for a while as being much more educated than she was. And let me do a screen share. And is that showing up? It is, yes. So this is from Pat's book, My Reading Life, in which he said about his mother, she outread a whole generation of officers' wives, but still wilted in embarrassment when asked about her college degree. I was a teenager when I heard Mom claim that she had just finished her first year at Agnes Scott when she dropped out to marry my father. By the time I graduated Citadel, my mother was saying that she had matriculated with honors from Agnes Scott with a degree in English. Her vast reading provided all the armor she needed to camouflage her lack of education. A library could show you everything if you knew where to look. Think about that. By virtue of access to libraries and librarians, Peg Conroy is able to get what seems as though a college education, so much so that she's able to masquerade as being college educated when in the company of other college educated women. That speaks volumes about the importance of the work that goes on in libraries and what librarians can do for their patrons. So let me show you a couple other things in this room, and then we will move on to our next room. And these don't necessarily relate to libraries, but they are fascinating nonetheless. You can kind of see them behind the Conroy family portrait here. If we go over here, we have 2 portraits, one of Pat Conroy right there, and another of Pat's widow and fellow Southern writer Cassandra King over here. These are both done by the same artist. His name is Anthony Johnson. He's an African-American artist originally from Ohio. And he did Pat's portrait when he was all of 17 years old, and he did Cassandra's portrait when he was 19. And if we get close on this, or if we zoom in, which we can kind of do, there we are. You can start to see the shape and outline of words. This is done in a style of artwork called journal art. It's actually a little easier to see over here on Cassandra's. So Anthony isn't so much drawing these portraits as he is writing them using words from both of these authors' books. The Water is Wide in Pat's case and Tell Me a Story in Cassandra's case. Pretty remarkable artwork. Anthony mostly does pieces on commission now, because he's become so popular. And part of that popularity relates to a very short documentary video that ETV made about the Pat Conroy portrait. And Anthony did that as a 17-year-old. So it's been a real pleasure to get to know him and to be supportive of his path as an artist. Let me show you a couple other things. By flipping the camera back around again, we see a whole lot of books in this room, and we will see them again when we get to our third room. Those are some of the roughly 7,000 books that Pat had in his personal library. When he was a sophomore in high school at Gonzaga High School in Washington, D.C., the year before the Conroys come here to Beaufort, he had a teacher named Joseph Monty who was studying to be a Jesuit priest. And Joe Monty told all the kids in that classroom that they should make it a goal to read 200 pages a day. And Pat took him seriously. He did that his whole life. That was his goal every single day, to read at least 200 pages. And Pat's mother, Peg, really liked that idea as well. So she took it as her personal mission to try and read 200 pages also, again, from the time that Pat was a sophomore in high school. So if we go this way, I'll show you two other things quickly in this room, and then we will move on to our next room. Those of you familiar with the four of Pat's books that were made into movies, you are most certainly familiar with The Prince of Tides, which was filmed right here in Beaufort. So we have a couple of things related to the movie here. This is a production assistant's jacket from the film set there below us. And then up top here, we have a couple of movie lobby cards. There's Nick Nolte and Barbara Streisand in that one. And then above that, we have the actors playing the Wingo family down there. The Great Santini film, which was based on Pat's first novel, published 1976, film in 1979, was also shot right here in Beaufort. And for that film, we also have a full set of lobby cards, quite a few of them going up the wall here, and some other related material. Most of that movie, at least the interior shots of that movie, were filmed in this house right here. This is Title Home, which is a beautiful home on the Point, a few blocks from where we are here at the Conroy Center. And it worked so well as the setting for The Great Santini that a different film company came back a few years later and filmed The Big Chill in that very same house. And because of the success of those two movies, major motion pictures were filmed here in Beaufort right up through the 1990s with Forrest Gump. So it was really The Great Santini, Pat Conroy's first book, or first novel, excuse me, being adapted for film that kicked off what became the movie-making boom here in Beaufort. So let's go out back into this room. If the room behind us is about Pat's family, this is the room that is all about Pat Conroy as a student and teacher. So this is sort of our education themed room. I mentioned that Pat was at Gonzaga High School the year before he came here to Beaufort. And that year is 1961. Pat was 16 years old, and we're looking at some of his high school photographs on the wall right here. When the Conroys came here in 61, Pat was 16 years old, and it was the 23rd time the family had moved since he had been born. That was the military brat lifestyle that Pat was brought up into. He was perpetually the new kid, the shy and awkward kid at every single school he went to. And part of the reason for that was, of course, the frequent moves of the family, but also that Pat was carrying the secret that he was being physically and verbally abused at home by his father. And the family knew they needed to keep that a secret. So Pat really never felt he could make connections to other students or other teachers, particularly when he was moving around so much. But in Beaufort, all of that changed. When they came here in 61, it was just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the colonel's appointment at the Beaufort Air Station was going to be for 2 years. So Pat knew that he would have both his junior and senior years at Beaufort High School. And that was also the first public school that Pat ever went to. He was being raised Roman Catholic, just like his father. So he'd been going to private schools, Catholic schools, all that time. And here in Beaufort, Pat meets a remarkable group of students and an amazing group of teachers who start to show him different models of adulthood than what he's seeing at home with his father. And he finds a great group of role models. And let me see if I can show you a photo of some of those nice folks as well. The pantheon of teachers at Beaufort High at the time is just incredibly remarkable, but here are 3 good examples of that. So we're looking at Pat's high school principal, Bill Dufford, who showed Pat what it meant to be a leader in a community. Dufford believed that his presence in Beaufort as the head of Beaufort High School was something that everybody needed to know about and care about. So he went as sort of the ambassador of the high school through all walks of life in the community, making sure that everybody knew about Beaufort High and cared about it, whether they had ever gone there or ever had a kid that went there. And he started to show Pat what a life of leadership and service might look like. In the middle there is Jean Norris, and Jean was Pat's high school English teacher his junior year, but really a lifelong mentor to Pat too. And it was Jean who first recognized that Pat not only had the ambitions to be a writer, but also had the capacity that could be a dream come true for Pat if he would stick with it. And one of the things that Jean did to help Pat and several other students on that path into the house of literature was Jean recruited the first creative writing teacher that Beaufort High ever had. Her name is Ann Head, and she's in the third photograph there. She was being published in all the major women's magazines of the day in the 1950s and 1960s. She had 4 novels published in book form, all by Doubleday, the same publisher in New York that will eventually publish Pat Conroy. So at the time that Pat is 17, 18 years old, he's learning about a life as a writer from an incredibly successful writer who lives right here in his town. They're a remarkable group of teachers. And if I switch the camera around back to yearbook photos, we will see what happens to Pat because of his exposure to this great group of teachers. He goes from being shy, awkward kid, as he had been in every other school, to being senior class president, captain and MVP of the basketball team, best all around, Mr. Congeniality. He's in the National Honor Society. He's playing other sports as well. He's every single thing you can be at Beaufort High because of how supportive these teachers are. And there's Jean Norris right over there in that photo as well. Pat is also being published for the very first time in his life because Beaufort High has a literary magazine called Breakers. And if I go this way around our table here, I can show you some of Pat's early works. Hey, Marlena, right over here in this case, and we'll see if we get a glare on this tonight. Oh, looks like we're going to be a little bit glary. Yep, can you help me get that open? Thank you. There we are. So this is some of the early poetry of Pat Conroy, which we're able to display here, including a piece on this side that was published in Breakers Literary Magazine. Pat started out very much wanting to be a poet, and that's an ambition he has in high school and then all through college as well. But as our subject tonight is libraries and librarians, I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to tell you about Pat's high school librarian, Eileen Hunter. And let me see if I can put Miss Hunter on screen for you for a second here. Yeah, she is a rather fascinating figure, and Pat wrote about her in an essay in my reading life simply called The Librarian. So there's Miss Hunter, and there's the high school library at Beaufort High as it looked when Pat was a student. And in that essay, Pat says, among librarians, I was popular in every town I landed in until I got to Beaufort, South Carolina. Then Eileen Hunter stormed into my life. And I want to read just a little bit from that essay in my reading life to give you a better picture of Miss Hunter in Pat's voice. And to do that, we're going to go right over here, plop our tripod down. So I won't read a long passage, but again, this is from my reading life. And this is one of the funnier moments in a long essay. In the halls of Beaufort High School, I had heard rumors of Miss Hunter. She was famous among both teachers and librarians for her legendary temper and her need for absolute control of her book-lined fiefdom. So Pat, at this point, is not yet the popular kid at Beaufort High that he will become. And what he is doing is going to the library during lunch and hiding because he doesn't know anybody in the school, so he has nobody to sit with at lunch. And he finds a copy of Victor Hugo's Les Mis, and he's reading that. And it's this huge, beautiful French novel. And there's, 16-year-old Pat Conroy in the library reading that when Eileen Hunter discovers him. And here's the exchange, as Pat remembered it many years later. Who's to say if it actually happened this way? But this is Pat's version of it. So this is Miss Hunter speaking. What on earth are you doing here? I'm reading a book, ma'am, I said. I can see that. Do I look like an idiot or something? Miss Hunter snapped. It's against the rules for a student to use a library during lunchtime. Sorry, ma'am, I didn't know that, I replied. What's that book you're reading? She grabbed it out of my hand and examined it as though it were pornographic contraband. She studied the book, and then she eyed me with a ferocious scowl. The book's never even been checked out. Are you reading it for the dirty parts? She asked, as though she'd cracked the mystery of this strange encounter. I didn't know it had dirty parts, I answered. If it does, I'll toss it with the morning trash. If you find anything dirty, you report it directly to me. Hugo's a Frenchman. I don't like his books. Do you know what I hear about this Hugo guy? No, ma'am. His characters, she said, studying the cover of the book. He's depressing. All the folks he writes about are just so miserable. We've got another one of his books. You ought to try that one instead. It's about a football team. Do you like football? Yes, ma'am, I said. Eileen Hunter seemed pleased at my answer and then pulled another volume of Victor Hugo from the shelf. She then handed me a copy of The Hunchback of Notre Dame for my reading pleasure. Though she never demonstrated a shred of affection for me, I heard from other teachers that Miss Hunter thought highly of me and always admired my passion for French literature. Checking a book out of the Beaufort High School library required a swashbuckling, adventurous spirit as Miss Hunter patrolled those aisles with the austerity of a knight errant. Whenever she checked a book out of the library, she treated the poor student as she would a visiting pirate. For Miss Hunter, I think the state of nirvana would be a library cleaned of all readers and the books all shelved and accounted for. As a librarian, she was legendary in all the wrong ways and for all the wrong reasons. A lovely portrait of Miss Hunter, and very different experience for Pat Conroy than what he and his mother had enjoyed in public libraries until that point. So after graduating from Beaufort High School, Pat goes to the Citadel Military College in Charleston. And here are some photos of Pat as a cadet at the Citadel. There, just as at Beaufort High School, by his senior year, he is captain and MVP of the basketball team. And he's also not only writing for the literary magazine, he is an editor for it as well. So at a very young age, Pat is a writer who wants to help other writers. And if we go this way, we can actually see a whole lot more Citadel material over here on this wall. Most of these pieces were actually donated to us by Pat's actual Citadel roommate, Mike DeVito, to whom Pat's novel, The Lords of Discipline, is dedicated. And one of the great treasures Mike brought us is this portrait of the Boo, Colonel Corvese, who was Pat's mentor at the Citadel. And I'm not sure that's going to show up on camera, but it is signed by the Boo to the other who made Conroy possible, meaning to Mike DeVito, the other who made the Conroy possible. And then he actually signs it the Boo, as though that's the man's name. Isn't that lovely? And then we have some other interesting pieces around here too, including a more contemporary Citadel jersey. Pat's number was 22, which has since been retired in honor of Pat. But this is not Pat's jersey. It's a more, as I said, contemporary one, but it is signed by Pat. And then we have a copy of the letter that the Citadel was sending out from, I think, 1999 onward, welcoming new cadets, written in Pat's signature, representing the class of 67 there. So at the Citadel in the 1960s, when Pat is a student, it's a particularly rough time to be a Citadel cadet. During the Vietnam War, the president of the Citadel at the time thought it was his responsibility to prepare his cadets to survive a prisoner of war experience if that's something they encountered in their service. So he took his job very seriously, perhaps too seriously. And Pat encountered a lot of physical abuse, particularly his freshman year, his knob year. And that's ultimately what inspires Pat to write not one, not two, but 3 books about his Citadel experience to kind of unpack and explain and hopefully change that situation. And because of that, Pat and his books were banned on the Citadel campus for a long time until he outlived his enemies and was invited back. And that's what prompted the letter that we just looked at on the wall. That's again was started being sent out in '99. In 2000, Pat was invited back to receive an honorary doctorate, which he accepted only if his mentor, the Boo, was going to be given one as well. So Pat and the Boo were both given honorary doctorates in 2000. In 2001, Pat was invited back a second time to give the commencement address. And in that address, which you can find and watch on YouTube, it's all about 10 or 15 minutes long, Pat told the cadets, the class of 2001, that he was inviting them to his funeral, not to be morbid about it, but to try and teach them a lesson about the passage of time. And he told them all they would have to do to gain entrance to his funeral was to say, "I wear the ring," which is the opening line of Words of Discipline. When Pat actually did die, March 4th of 2016, over 100 of those members of class of 2001 came to his funeral where they served as an honor guard. It was remarkable to see that class feels a particularly strong attachment to Pat, almost as much as the class of 67, which was Pat's actual graduating class. But Pat had a wonderful experience with the library at the Citadel as well, the Daniel Library. And I don't have any artifacts that I can show you about that, but I can definitely tell you a story or two about it. So let me once again try and do a little screen share here. And let's see if we can do that with 1, 2, 3 slides this time. There we are. So this is a fairly recent shot of the interior of the real library at the Citadel, the Daniel Library. And this is how Pat described his experience with that library when he was writing about it in The Death of Santini, which was the last of Pat's books published during his lifetime. It came out in 2013. For 4 years, I would enter the library and find a welcoming world of solitude and books awaiting my inspection. And in their mute attentiveness, I heard those same books trying to call out my name as I wandered through their marvelous stacks at my leisure. There at the Daniel Library, I found the college education I was looking for, and I would carry piles of books across the parade ground at night and bring back the ones I'd finished reading the next afternoon. The faculty wives began to call me the boy with the books. So Pat is reading so many books as a student at the Citadel in the 1960s that he actually stands out because of that. He gets a nickname because of that very thing. It's not common among the cadets of the era to be as well read as Pat. But Pat loved that library and that experience so much so that he made it integral to the plot of his novel, The Lords of Discipline. Libraries show up in all of Pat's novels and almost all of his memoirs, of his nonfiction books as well, but they're typically personal libraries in someone's home, and they're reflective of the character who owns and lives in that space. But in The Lords of Discipline, it's the Daniel Library, it's the University Library, and it's not just reflective of the characters, it's absolutely essential to the plot of the novel. In that novel and in that film, for those of you who've read it or who have seen it, you might remember that a subplot of the novel and a major plot of the film is that the first African-American cadet is on campus that year. And Will McLean, the protagonist, the character is loosely based on Pat Conroy, is assigned to be the liaison to Tom Pierce, the African-American cadet. And Tom and Will realize early on they're going to need a way to communicate that isn't public, or they're just going to draw more unwanted attention to themselves. And what they decide is this, as Pat writes in the book, Words of Discipline. This is Will McLean speaking to Tom Pierce. "You write me a note and place it between pages 308 and 309 of The Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler in the philosophy section of the library. The book hasn't been checked out in the history of the Institute." And that is indeed the technique that they use to pass notes in the Words of Discipline. And it's actually quite successful for a while, but not to give away too much of the plot of the novel or the plot of the film. But what ultimately happens is that notes are intercepted, and that reveals the great betrayal of the novel. So the library, that book, and this technique of communicating all are ultimately very essential to this novel, much more so than libraries are in any of Pat's other books. That's how important the real Daniel Library was to the real Pat Conroy, that he wrote it in almost as a character, not just a setting, but a character in Words of Discipline. So when Pat's Citadel classmate, John Worley, who is now a 5-time novelist himself and a dear friend to us here at the Conroy Center, wanted to show me around the Citadel one day and tell me some Pat Conroy stories as we were putting together a walking tour of the Citadel that John still offers to this day. John was telling me about the real Pat Conroy and his relationship with the real Citadel, and I was reminding him of the fictional character Will McLean's relationship with the fictional but kind of not fictional Carolina Military Institute. We both ended up talking about the library, and we realized something that day on the Citadel campus, and that was that in all the years we had been on that campus and all the times we had been in the Daniel Library, it never occurred to either one of us to check to see if the real Daniel Library had a copy of Decline of the West. So we rushed back over to the library, looked it up in the online card catalog, And we were elated to discover they did in fact have exactly one copy of Decline of the West, the 1945 edition, which is a single volume edition. Otherwise you see it as a 2-volume edition. And we went to the shelf and there it was. And according to the card catalog, it had been checked out, but not in 10 years. So it had been sitting on that shelf a while. And once we found it, naturally we had to open it up and see if there was anything between pages 308 and 309. And we actually found 2 notes in that book, not just 1, but 2. One was up around page 112, I think. And in the film version of Words of Discipline, the page numbers are not mentioned. So that note could have been left by somebody who had seen the film but not read the book. But the other note was indeed between 308, 309. And that second note, which was properly placed, said this: "Help me, Will." So we think about that a lot. Some literary pilgrim decided to leave a note to the fictional Will McLean in this copy of Decline of the West that was there in the real Daniel Library. That's the power of Pat Conroy's writing, that people want to engage not just with the real world he described, but also with the fictional world and the fictional characters he described. That particular copy of Decline of the West has been moved to rare books and special collections in the Daniel Library because it is kind of a literary artifact in its way, with those notes still in it. So that was a lovely thing to discover that day. I'm glad John had the foresight to go look in the library and see what we could find. So let me tell you a couple other things about this room right here. And to do that, I'm going to go reverse our camera again and look at these 2 panels on the wall. So after Pat graduates from the Citadel in 1967, he comes back here to Beaufort and he teaches at Beaufort High School for 2 years. He is teaching government and psychology. And let me get the camera where we can see that photo of Pat. There he is. So this is Pat in the classroom at Beaufort High School right there. There are a couple of problems at Beaufort High at the time, and young liberal-minded teacher Pat Conroy decides he's going to take it upon himself to solve both of them without really asking anybody's permission. One has to do with teen pregnancy. A small southern town like Beaufort did not have a sex education class yet at that time, and because of that, there was a correspondingly high teen pregnancy rate. So Pat decided to incorporate human sexuality into his psychology class. And because of that, teen pregnancy rates at Beaufort High actually dropped. Something about hearing sex described by Pat Conroy made teenagers want nothing whatsoever to do with it. It's a really smart technique, as it turned out. Pat also realized he could do something to address a larger concern at Beaufort High. The school was not yet integrated, but through a program called Freedom of Choice, there were a growing number of African-American students on campus, about 100 of them at that point, in fact. And in 1968, just after the assassination of Dr. King, some of those students came up to Pat and asked him if he would be faculty advisor to a brand new Afro-American culture club, as it was called at the time, which Pat readily agreed to do, but he also wanted to teach it. He wanted to incorporate it into the curriculum. So he got permission to teach what may have been the first African-American studies class taught in any public school in the state of South Carolina. And that was the 1968-1969 school year. So after 2 years of teaching at Beaufort High, Pat is thinking about going into the Peace Corps and instead discovers he can have a Peace Corps-like experience without even leaving Beaufort County. And that's what leads to this set of photos. This is Pat teaching on Dufford Island, 1969-1970 school year. He was the first white school teacher and the first male school teacher on the island. And I'll walk over here and show you some other photos relating to that as well. This is, of course, the year that will ultimately inspire Pat to write The Water is Wide. And let's see if we can do that without much. Yep, Marlena, if you'll help me open that case again. There we are without the glare. So Pat goes over to Dufford Island. He has 18 students, grades 5 through 8, and no experience whatsoever teaching kids that young. He gets out there and realizes that separate is not equal at all. And through no fault of their own, these kids have been denied an access to education that would be equal to their white counterparts. And he decides he's not only going to give them an equal education, he's ultimately going to give them a superior education to their white counterparts. And he does that by bringing all sorts of guest speakers to the island, about 40 by his estimation in the span of that year. And these are artists and doctors and lawyers and scientists, and they're opening up the imaginations of these kids to the world beyond their island. About this time of year, Pat also brings the students into town to go trick-or-treating in the historic district, The Point. And he takes them on a trip to Washington, D.C. And in town at Beaufort High, you don't get to go to D.C. until your senior class trip. So now Pat is doing that for the equivalent of middle school students. And he's giving them just an incredible experience. It really is changing the arc of their lives. Of those 18 students, I've met the 13 who are still living. 4 of them go on to become teachers themselves, inspired by Pat. That's how remarkable his influence on them was. But what this does for Pat is not get him rewarded by the school board, it gets him fired by the school board instead. He is far too liberal and too controversial for the school superintendent and the school board of that era. And Pat is given the chance to resign rather than have it on his record that he's been fired. And he makes an appeal to the school board, a building that's just down the street from where the Conroy Center is, where they offered him that chance to resign rather than have the termination on his record. But Pat Conroy is the son of a fighter pilot, the son of a warrior, and he's not simply going to accept defeat. So instead, what he does is go to this courthouse that's just across the street from the Conroy Center, and he files paperwork to sue for wrongful termination. He takes the school board to court, not in that courthouse, but in another one county over. And that becomes a national news story. There are reporters here in tiny little Beaufort, South Carolina, who are from the Washington Post and the New York Times covering the firing of the white school teacher. It's that level of national news. And they're all telling Pat that this is more than a news article. You need to do something bigger than this. You need to write a book about this. And right up until the point the judge delivers his verdict, Pat and his lawyer, George Trask, are absolutely convinced Pat's going to win this case. He's going to go right back in the classroom. When that doesn't happen, he gets angry and he does something with that anger. He writes a book about it exactly as he has been advised. And by virtue of a connection that one of these reporters has, Pat has a contact for Julian Bach, who is probably one of the top 10, maybe even top 5 literary agents of the time. And Pat is able to call up this guy, and Julian can't understand why this fired teacher from nowhere, South Carolina, is calling him. But there's so much passion in Pat's voice, and there's just something that sounds important about this story that Julian agrees to receive this manuscript from Pat Conroy, and then to represent Pat, and then to see that the book is published by Houghton Mifflin, a major publishing house, publisher of Henry David Thoreau. And it's Julian Bach who's able to place the movie rights for Water is Wide to create the film Conrack, which comes out just a few years later, starring John Voight. So before Pat Conroy is even 30 years old, he's had a book come out with a major publisher and a movie made about that. And at this point, he's really only famous for being fired, which is a difficult thing to be famous for, as it turns out. But the book does fairly well, and the movie does even better, of course. And Pat's agent and his publisher all want him to keep writing books about being a teacher, but there's an obvious problem with that. Pat Conroy is never going to be a teacher again, not in the classroom sense of that word, but he continues to be a teacher in a much larger sense of that word as a mentor figure to many writers, including me, over the whole 50-year arc of his writing career. So what Pat tells Julian and his publisher in that moment when they're asking him what his next book might be about is that he thinks he can tell a story about being the son of a fighter pilot, about being the child of abuse, about being the child of a national war hero who is also the great villain of his own childhood and the life of his families, and try and get to the heart of what that means. And that's what leads to Pat's first novel, The Great Santini, which is then also made into a film. And that then leads to The Words of Discipline, when Pat decides he wants to tell the truth about his military college experience. And that too is made into a film. And that what in turn leads Pat to write The Prince of Tides, probably his best known book, and certainly the best known of the films, directed, produced, even written to some degree by Barbra Streisand, and also filmed right here in Beaufort. And that gets us into the 1990s. So Pat, all this while, has been gone from Beaufort, South Carolina. He's simply been too controversial to be a full-time resident of the Low Country. But all of his books are about the Low Country. They're all about Beaufort and Charleston, or at least fictional versions of those places. He's trying to get back here in his imagination. And in the 1990s, when Pat is writing Beach Music, his next novel in the sequence there, he realizes that he needs to be physically present in the Low Country for a long time, not just staying at somebody's house on a research trip, but he needs to really have a presence of his own in Beaufort for the first time in about 20 years. And that's what leads him to buy what he always referred to as the worst house on Fripp Island, although it definitely was not that. And that is where this desk started out. This is Pat Conroy's writing desk from his Fripp Island house, and that is his chair from that same time period and afterwards. And Pat bought that house again in the early 90s, originally to be a writer's retreat, but when he divorced his second wife before his 50th birthday, it became his primary residence. So about half of Pat's books were written longhand at this desk on a yellow legal pad. Typically, Pat never learned to type, so everything was written longhand, very much in the same setup that we have it there. And if I can do this, which I think I can show you how that desk looked in the Fripp Island house. There's a photo of it in that context. And as you see there, it is surrounded by bookshelves. Pat had shelves built in every room in the Fripp Island house, other than the bathrooms, obviously. And we were able to recreate that look here in our Conroy Center because this building used to be a law office and it had all these beautiful built-in shelves already here. So once again, we're looking at sort of a representative set of Pat's books from his personal library. It was really important to Pat not only to have books in his life, but to feel as though he were living in a library, because libraries, public libraries in particular, had been so important to Pat and his mother when Pat was very young. And the Daniel Library had been so important to Pat as a college student. So at a time in his life when he seemed like he was at the pinnacle of success, when major motion pictures were being made from his books and he was as famous as he was ever going to be, his personal life was actually falling apart, and not many people knew about that. And Pat needed a safe place, a cocoon, if you will, in which he could rebuild himself. And that's why he put so many books and so many bookshelves into that Fripp Island house during that period when he was really trying to rebuild his life and take control of some self-destructive habits. So the books in the library in that Fripp house weren't just for show. They weren't for other people to see how many books Pat had. They were to help him feel like he was living and reworking himself in a library, because libraries have been so important to him for so long. I want to show you a couple other pieces in this room right here, and then I'll very happily open the floor for questions. So we're going to look at three pieces pretty quickly here. This is our official portrait of Pat Conroy. This was done by the artist Susan Graber, who is a fantastic portrait artist here in the Low Country. Susan's husband, Scott, was a Citadel classmate of Pat's, and Scott is now a lawyer and also a novelist as well, and one of the 67 contributing writers to Our Prince of Scribes, in which Scott tells a really wonderful story of what it was like not only to be Pat's classmate, but in some ways his nemesis at the Citadel. And Susan did a beautiful, beautiful portrait of Pat for us. Over here in this corner of the room, if I pan down that way, there we are. This is one of our two donation boxes, and this was built by a group of students from May River High School in Bluffton, a couple towns over from us here in Beaufort. They were a welding class, master fabricators as they're called, and this is entirely their own design. The base of the sculpture is the outline of the state of South Carolina. There are two palmetto trees, our state trees, growing up out of it. And then on top is a book, which to them represents reading, writing, and teaching. So the educational legacy of Pat Conroy, a really beautiful piece that they made and donated to our original center. And here we have a bunch of images of Pat Conroy from various points in his life. And that brings us over here to the last artifact I will show you on our virtual tour. We have a pair of Pat Conroy's pants on display, and that's kind of an odd thing to have in a museum. If you go to the Faulkner house, you're definitely not going to see Faulkner's pants under glass anywhere. But this pair of pants has a very interesting story. The largest book club in the United States is this group called the Pulpwood Queens, and they have been in existence for over 20 years. There are Pulpwood Queen chapters all over the United States and to some degree beyond the states as well, including one that meets here at the Conroy Center. And they have an annual book club convention called Girlfriends Weekend in Jefferson, Texas. They've been doing that for a long, long time. And Pat was invited to come multiple years and kept saying no because he didn't quite understand what it was. But then Pat's daughter, Melissa, second oldest of the four Conroy daughters, had her first children's book come out. It's called Poppy's Pants. And now we're looking at the Poppy doll, who's obviously inspired by Pat Conroy, sitting right there. So Pat decides that he and Melissa can go to the Pulpwood Queen's Girlfriend Weekend together, and they can have a really good time, which is exactly what happens. But when they get there, they also discover that there is an annual auction, a fundraiser for Dolly Parton's Imagination Library, really wonderful nonprofit that gives books to kids, which in many cases may be the first book that child has ever had of his or her own. And they're very happy to support that, but they've not actually brought anything for this fundraiser, for this auction. So what Pat Conroy decides to do is, in honor of his daughter Melissa's book, Poppy's Pants, to donate a pair of his own pants, which he takes off on stage and signs, and they sell at auction for $1,000 to a writer named M.L. Malcolm, who wasn't even that familiar with Pat Conroy, but she just thought it was amazing that this New York Times bestselling author was going to donate a pair of his own pants for this fundraiser. So Malcolm pays $1,000 for them and then turns around and gives them to Kathy Patrick at the time, Kathy Murphy now, the Pulpwood Queen, the woman who created the organization. And Kathy has them put in this shadow box, which she told me cost her $800. So now $1,800 have been spent on a pair of Pat Conroy's stained and signed pants. And Kathy kept them in her house until 2019 when she drove them across the country to donate them to us at the Conroy Center. And the Pulpwood Queens continue to meet virtually these past 2 years, but still meeting nonetheless. And they still have that annual fundraiser. But in recent years, it's been for us, it's been for the Conroy Center. And that's what makes possible our own annual Low Country Book Club convention as a wonderful annual event that honors the generosity of that gift as a benefit for readers and writers both. But it all begins with Pat Conroy taking his pants off on stage in 2011 as a sort of interesting act of generosity. So with that said, gang, I'm going to happily answer any questions that you might have, and you're welcome to unmute yourselves if you want to ask them or type them into the chat. And we'll stay up here in Pat's office as well. So let me try and get that back in the shot. There we are. There it is behind me.
I think we've got a question in the chat there.
Do we? Can you open the chat? I can open the chat. I can do that.
You did not provide technical assistance with how to work the device that you gave me.
I did not. So we have more of a comment than a question from Susan, who's with us, who worked part-time. She says she worked part-time in the Daniel Library from 98 to 2000. And yes, saw Pat visiting the library. It was, who was that? Professor Herb Nanth. Yeah, Pat was a guest speaker for the Friends of the Daniel Library. This may not be the event you're describing, but Pat was a guest speaker for the Friends of the Daniel Library, which at that time was run by my friend Angie LeClaire, who was the daughter, one of the daughters of Mrs. Whaley, of Mrs. Whaley's Charleston Garden fame. And she was one of several people at the Citadel who sort of cleared the path and welcomed Pat back at a time when not everybody was ready to do that. And Angie was a great supporter of Pat's and a dear friend to a lot of us as well. So yeah, the Daniel Library continued to be very important to Pat long after his college experience.
Jonathan, this has been fantastic, and we'll have to, there we go. We have to
Yes.
apologize for the height adjustment there.
There we are. Yes.
This facility is amazing, and I think statistically, most data shows us that there are a lot of nonprofits out there, and many do not have a home site, have an actual brick and mortar facility. Friends of the library are sort of automatically gifted with a building at your disposal. So having this brick and mortar location where people can come and they can visit and can see these artifacts sort of helps open the pocketbook a little bit there.
It does,
Yeah.
absolutely. It didn't seem like a particularly good idea at first to
Right.
have a capital campaign during a pandemic election year. And yet here we stand in a building that we own because something about having a physical presence really does speak to people. They can envision what that is and why it matters. So they're much more generous in their giving, not only for the sake of the building, but for what goes on in the building as well.
So Friends of the Library, I mean, you already have this beautiful building. You know, your mission as an organization is to support that building, its staff, and its purpose, and all of the good work that it does in the community. So, you know, maybe you can't have a bookstore inside your library, or perhaps you can't have a gift shop inside your library, but surely there is a way to have a small dedicated space, you know, something that you can draw attention to and spotlight the good work that your organization is doing. So definitely something I would recommend talking to branch managers or library directors about carving out a little space for yourself as the Friends organization.
It definitely matters to a lot of people to have a space that they can visit, that they can associate with your organization. When the Conroy Center was just starting out, we had 700 square foot of space. Even that was valuable, but we couldn't have a single program in it. So the place we went most often and are tremendously grateful for was the library, was Beaufort County Library, which made meeting spaces available to us in all of the branches. And we continue to have partnerships with the library and with the Friends group here to this day, including some innovative ones that are coming up that we'll start talking about next year as well, that are really great benefits to this community above and beyond the physical space of the library, things that where we can bring the library into the community in really interesting ways also.
And just to clarify, I don't know that of all the different fundraising opportunities, taking your pants off is one that we would automatically jump to. It worked. It helped.
One time. It worked.
One time.
Yes.
I don't know about asking your branch manager or your library staff to potentially do some sort of fundraising campaign.
I would not recommend it.
Yeah, I think not.
No.
All right. Well, if there are any other questions, you're welcome to go ahead and put them in the chat or take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask them of either Jonathan or myself. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and put a link to the Friends of South Carolina Library's website into the chat. There's a lot of great information about our organization, the different works that we do, how you can become a member, how you can volunteer, how you can celebrate National Friends of the Library Week, and also information about our upcoming annual conference. Our second annual conference is going to be held on Friday, November 5th. It is an all-day affair. We are blessed enough to be able to hold it at the beautiful Wando Mount Pleasant Library. We are holding it with a limited number of in-person attendees and also a Zoom option. So
folks can join in exactly the same way you've joined tonight.
I can't get in here. I wanted to say something. Shucks.
all right. Any other questions?
I was going to participate, but yeah.
I think we hear somebody on there. If everybody has a question, you can go ahead and.
Yes, is there a question?
No.
Oh, there's a thank you. Yes.
Oh.
Thank yous are nice. You can definitely say thank you. And thank you to all of you who are with us, not just here in the Zoom room, but those watching on Facebook as well. This has been a really wonderful collaboration with FOSCL, one of many I've gotten to do in recent years. And they're always special, not just because libraries are so important to Pat, but because they continue to be so important to me as well.
Well, thank you again for joining us, everybody. Thank you for taking some time. We appreciate it. And happy National Friends of the Library Week, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you all.
Oh, hey, Lee.
You can end, I can end, I will end the meeting.